Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Today's video is kind of another frequently asked question follow-up, and I thought I'd make it a bit of a tutorial. So I see a lot of questions on my AX8 videos asking how I go about recording it, if this is even a capable unit for studio recording, if this is the right one for the person's needs, and just how capable is it. And I'm going to attempt to show how capable the unit is out of the box, assuming you have some other compatible hardware, as well as how I actually use it when I record, and go a couple steps further and show some other neat tricks and that sort of thing. So this video is just kind of be a tips and tricks video, if you will, show you how I set up my recording patches, because they're not exactly the same as how I would just record or use a just a jam patch or what I use through my tube amps, that sort of thing. So a few nuances, and it's another topic that's easier explained when shown, because it gets kind of messy when you set up different inputs and outputs and that sort of thing, but it's really not that complicated if you draw it out. It can just get kind of complicated on the software level. So we'll go through it kind of step by step and show you what I do in Cubase. Of course, you can use Logic, Pro Tools, whatever you like, as well as on the AX8 software. Before I get into the gritty details of setting up your AX8 patch and audio workstation program, I think it's valuable to just take an overview of the AX8's recording potential, and that'll kind of give you a mindset as to how you should use it and what you should expect out of it. So compared to its bigger brother, the AX8 and assuming this video doesn't just like die immediately, the AX8 will be out very soon, especially compared to that unit. It is a bit limited on the processing side, still very powerful. For instance, on the AX8 you can play through 2 amp blocks simultaneously in real time, and that would be like playing through 2 amp heads in real life. So if you rely heavily on mixing and matching amp heads for your rhythm tone, this could be a bit problematic for you with the AX8, because you can only do 1 amp block at a time, but it's definitely not the end of the world. So if we were using the AX8 here, the AX8, I would probably run stereo paths and record 2 guitar tracks at the same time with like 1 amp on one channel, 1 amp on the other channel. Of course, it would still be double tracking. So the way we're going to do this is have 1 guitar on the left side, 1 guitar on the right side, fully panned. You can get a little bit more crazy, but for right now, we're just going to stick with double tracking. And you can mix and match your levels of each amp. Many guitarists, many artists do this. It's nothing crazy. What I like to do on the AX8, because you don't have the extra amplifier options in real time, is do that with cabinets. So fortunately, the cabinet block is also stereo, but it lets you mix and match up to two, that is, impulse responses. So what we're going to do here is, in our cab block, take 2 of your favorite impulse responses. So I'll throw a couple of V30s there, maybe one with G12s, both of them 4x12, and we'll pan 1 all the way left, pan 1 all the way right. Now, a big trick here that even the manufacturers from Fractal Audio recommend is to have a little bit of latency on one of those impulse responses. And this kind of simulates mic phasing. If you record a real cabinet and say you got an SM57 and a Neumann microphone, and they're looking at a speaker each, you're never going to be able to align them precisely. Unless you have just like a laboratory, there's no way you can measure and get the exact distance from one of the microphone's diaphragms to the center of the cone, wherever you're going. It's always going to be off a little bit, and that's pleasant to the human ear. That phasing does create some of the more realistic guitar sounds. And that's why for my more processed tones, I tend to keep it at 0, because it does help with clarity and brings out some of the definition of the guitar, but it also doesn't sound as realistic. So when I say add a little bit of delay to one of the impulse responses, we're not talking a lot here. We're talking 0.03 to 0.06 milliseconds, not seconds, milliseconds. And you can dial in between that range. That's generally what sounds best to me and what the Fractal Audio guys recommend. And that just adds a little bit of that human error that makes a guitar tone sound great to me in recording. And obviously that's only going to come out, that phasiness is only going to come out when you combine those two streams together in mono. One important thing to note is that on a lot of my videos, I use an enhancer block on the end of my signal chain just to make my guitar sound more full and pleasing to the ear on my stereo videos, obviously. In this case, you definitely don't want the enhancer on, since we're going to be taking two mono signals and putting them together on one channel, the left or the right. So make sure that's not on for your rhythm stuff. Of course, the AX8's myriad of outputs, recording in stereo is an absolute breeze. I prefer to use the SPDIF output. You'll see in Cubase, that's what I'm using as the input, because that's a total digital to digital conversation going on. There's no conversion between analog digital, keeps the signal 100% fractal, I guess you could say. Although if your interface doesn't support SPDIF, don't worry about it. You can use the XLR jacks and you get an analog conversion there, but it sounds identical. You're not going to be able to tell the difference. It's still perfect quality and nothing to worry about. Since we have another set of inputs and outputs to play with though, we're actually going to get one more signal recorded at the same time, and that is the DI track. And if you're not familiar with that term, that is direct input, and as you might imagine, that's just your guitar. Clean guitar signal coming from your pickups, no processing, no preamps, no nothing like that, just what's coming straight from the guitar. And that will allow you to either take that signal and send it out of your interface into say a real amplifier or your AX8 through reamping, or you can load software plugins like Bias or VST Amp Rack and put it on there if that is good enough for you. But really all that's doing is giving you options down the road. That way if you say, hey, this rhythm track I recorded isn't exactly what I want to try a different amplifier or even different effects or cab models on stuff other than your rhythm tracks or different bass guitar sound, then you don't actually have to re-record your performance. You can just send it back out through your audio interface. To do that, we're going to take advantage of the effects loop on the AX8. So what we're going to do is crank the output out to, in this case, to maximum. Then in our patch, we're going to stick the effects loop block in front of everything else in our signal chain. You can also kind of fork it off to the side, but we do want this to connect to all the other blocks. We're going to keep all those software parameters at 0. Then we're going to take a 1/4 inch line and run from the effects send of the AX8 to a line input on your audio interface. And this is where things could potentially get hairy. On the 6i6, they have 2 dedicated line inputs, but even then, did take some fiddling around to get it working in Cubase. They are not marked exactly on, doesn't necessarily say input 3 and input 4. They may be mismatched on your audio interface, so it might take some tinkering to make sure you're recording a clean guitar signal. But if you have it set up correctly, basically what will happen is that you're going to get 3 independent tracks coming out of your AX8 into your audio interface. You're going to get one stereo signal that's different on the left and right, so you're going to have 2 different cabinet sounds, and then you're going to have a DI track that is nothing but your plain guitar. Now we just have to get our audio workstation program to record all those tracks separately. So for each side, on the left and the right, we're going to make 3 separate tracks. So we're going to have guitar left with one cabinet, guitar left with the second cabinet, and guitar left with a direct input. We're going to mirror that on the right as well. For our input buses, we're going to have guitar cabinet 1 be left and guitar cabinet 2 be right. It doesn't matter. Just make sure that they're not stereo tracks. They are mono here, and we want the left and right separated and all panned to one side. And then for the DI track, I created a separate mono track and created a whole new DI input bus and selected an input until I started hearing the appropriate signal. And depending on how the handshake between your USB interface or sound card goes with your DAW, then you'll probably have to do the same if they're not labeled 100% correctly. But when you get it, you'll get a track with DI and then 2 tracks with processed guitars. If you get all that set up correctly, you hit arm on all the appropriate tracks, the end result will be a double track guitar with a nice blend between two different cabinets and then leftover DI tracks in case you change your mind later. And that's basically what I do for all my rhythm stuff. Because the AX8 can't do dual amps, I always just save the DI for later in case I either want to change the amps completely or blend something later on. I also tend to do this with my bass guitars, and I would recommend that you do the same. I did just that on my first AX8 bass patch, where I divided between frequencies, not so much cabinet sounds, although I will be using different impulse responses on both sides. And this is just to use kind of that typical heavy metal, high frequency, low frequency split. Nothing new, most bands do this nowadays. So I'll be having kind of like a higher gain, high frequency content, djenty bass sound, and then the rumbly, lower frequency, normal, aggressive bass sound on, you know, the left side and the right side. And I will split my signal accordingly. So say the top of my signal rung will be panned to the left, the bottom will be panned to the right. They'll both go through a stereo cabinet, one panned to the left, one panned to the right. And then we'll record that and the DI track again. You'll have 3 bass tracks, and then they will all be mono, but in the center instead of left and right. So your end result for your guitars and bass guitars is a nice, thick, but defined bass guitar in the center of your mix with a high and low frequency that you can mix between, change depending on how the mix of your song flows, and then guitar on the left and right. Now, if this isn't your first go around of recording, you know as well as I do that not everything is recorded in mono, and that you do want some stereo guitar sounds every now and again, such as clean guitars, leads, all that sort of stuff. I usually keep in stereo because they either don't sound good double tracked, or you just need a bit more depth. And especially with stuff like clean guitars, I like to keep it closer to the center of the mix, but have a little bit of spaciness to it. And so in this case, this is where I would use something like the enhancer block. And even though I'm using stereo cabinets, keep it to where the output is in stereo and not two split off mono signals. So say for a lead, we'll use everything else the same, still have a DI track in case you want to change it later, but we'll keep the cabinets not 100% panned. We'll say pan them 50%, 30%. You can keep them both dead center if you want to, or only use one, depends on what you want to do. I still prefer to use multiple impulse responses, again, just to get a little bit more depth in there. And then you can always throw the enhancer block here if you're going to use it in true stereo. I like it. It does add a little bit of depth because if I weren't going to do it here, I usually would do it in the Cubase plugin. There's also a stereo enhancer there. I think the fractal version is quite a bit better. So the only real practical differences here is that we're not panning cabinets 100%. We're using an enhancer block to give a little bit more stereo space. And in your workstation program, that's where you're going to have a stereo track instead of 2 mono tracks, and you're going to keep it in the center of your mix unless you want to do something crazy and have it like pan back and forth. But for the purpose of this video, this will be just like a normal guitar lead that you'd keep in the center. Now we come to the part of the video where half of you are probably thinking, great, I just spent all this time to set up my patches so I could record DI tracks. What the hell do I do with them? So honestly, the best thing to do in terms of compatibility is just to run those tracks right back through your AX8 if you're looking to reamp. So this would be tweaking parts of your patch, setting up brand new ones, changing your amps, changing your cabinets if you're looking for a new rhythm sound. And this would just be coming off of your interface. This can also be a bit hairy to set up, but fortunately I was able to get mine working just by sending it through one of my stereo outputs and setting it to mono, so having just a left signal come out, and worked really well that way. And this is where you'll want to go back into your AX8 patch and enable your effects loop block, make sure it's running through all the other effects blocks in your signal chain, and that will effectively become your new input block. Again, this may be another instance of having to fiddle with your input and output buses on your DAW, but if your audio interface or sound card does have a direct line output, things should run pretty smoothly. It is going from a direct, balance line out to a balance line in, so noise floor should be fine, all that good stuff. The downside of that, of recording the DI track from the effects loop block being a balanced line out, is that if you try to reamp directly from your audio interface to a real amplifier, as the name reamping would have you believe, you're going to run into some noise issues. And in this case, something like a dedicated DI box will be much more useful and produce a lot better results, because the noise floor is just absolutely horrific doing it with this interface. That's why I would recommend just sticking with the AX8. If you absolutely have to get a real amp sound at the same time as a process sound with the AX8, which I can't really see a big use case for, but if you have to do it, I would probably just run the effects loop block kind of in 4-cable method with your amplifier and record it somewhere else in another room with a microphone or whatever. There's ways around it, but I think the ideal use case, if you're asking about AX8s and wanting to record, is the silent option and just do 1 amp sound at a time. The other tricky part about this is that when you do successfully get your reamp track back into your workstation, it's going to be out of phase compared to the first process guitar signal, and that's because you took a signal, recorded it. There's a little bit of latency associated with that, but it's going to be in time with the original, and then you send that signal out of a audio interface which has some latency. It goes through an AX8 again, which has its own latency, and then back in the interface. And that round trip latency adds up, and it just sounds off. You're going to get something that sounds really phasey and just like a flanger's engaged. Not good results. Now, if you're just going to replace your previously recorded tracks, then you don't have much to worry about. That's the way I would recommend using it, using reamping on the AX8. That is, then you just delete or mute your past tracks. You're good to go. But if you're going to attempt to mix the two together, then you're going to have to get a little bit creative. You'll need something like a dephasing VST plugin, or you're going to have to go into your timeline and sync up like all of the individual wavelengths until they're perfectly in time. At least Cubase, I don't think is quite, or has quite enough resolution in the timeline to do that on a manual basis. So I bid you good luck if that's what you're going to try to do. But because of the limitations of 1 amp block, anyway, I would just suggest you use the AX8 as a 1 amp at a time unit and use reamping for either going back through the AX8 once again if you're unhappy with your tone the first time, or like in my case, I just kind of use the DI track as another just in case tool, because there's so many times that I'll record something and I'll get a new piece of gear and think, crap, I've got to re-record it and put it through that at some point. And that's kind of what I do with my DI tracks, just hang on to them for a rainy day if I want to go out and get some decent reamp gear and put it through a real amplifier, or put it through a new patch that just somehow obliterates what I was recording with at the time. So for my use cases, I don't often go back and reamp from scratch and that sort of thing, although it is nice to have if you need to at any point. So for a recap, some of the major points in this video: always record in stereo. I don't care if you're double tracking mono guitars or tracking a mono bass, always record in stereo, because you can just use that little bit of extra recording power to get a lot of results. Mixing those two cabinet impulse responses, adding a little bit of delay, just adds that much more human error and that much more believability to your guitar tone, and the results are always killer for me. So definitely recommend that. Always add an effects loop block and send out to your audio interface, record the DI just in case. It's never bad to have, because again, there's been so many times that I've tracked stuff just as a demo and actually had some good takes and wanted to hear what it sounded like in a full production without actually having to run through the whole project again. So it's nice to have those DI tracks on hand. If you're just starting out, I would actually recommend doing a little bit of research and make sure that you're purchasing the right audio interface or sound card that'll be compatible with this and gear moving forward. I highly recommend an SPDIF input and output. Of course, the AX8 doesn't necessarily have an input, but stuff like your studio monitors or other equipment could, so that would be a good nice to have. I would recommend the same methodology as far as patch construction goes for the bass guitar, except you're just going to put both the tracks in the center. And even if you're not doing the frequency split thing and you're playing a more traditional type of bass sound, you can still do it with different cabinet impulse responses. I think it still sounds really good there. And if you're recording a stereo guitar, something that's going to be more towards the center, but you want a little bit of depth, like on cleans or leads, then I would keep everything practically the same, but the enhancer block could come in handy there, and still mixing between a couple cab impulse responses again gives you some really nice, thick and organic results. So that's really my tips and tricks. It's not too complicated. Again, on paper, it's in practice where things can get a little bit confusing, and you'll be scratching your head and thinking, why isn't this working? And then you'll unplug cables, jiggle them around, and it will just work magically, because that's how stuff in a bedroom studio always goes. So yeah, this video is quite a bit more technical, and one of my areas of least expertise, just kind of one of those things that I trial and error to figure out. So I'm definitely not the best resource for this kind of stuff, but I did keep getting a lot of questions asking if the AX8 is a worthy recording tool, or if it just should be used for gigging, that sort of stuff. And it definitely is worthy for recording. It's very capable for reamping. It's just, I think it fits its niche in that get it the first time and keep everything else for just in case type of use case, which is good for me. So if you have any questions about your setup, please leave them. I'll try to get back to them, to your comments, as soon as I can. So that'll pretty much do it for this video. Hopefully see you in the near future with more Axe 3 and AX8 patches. I'm assuming those are going to be backwards compatible. So if you do upgrade, still stick around, because we'll still have some good stuff for you. So that'll be about it. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.